as Africa experts, we play a very critical role. We know that some of you are already in that space. For example, Jibril is the chair of the Adaptation Fund, and we congratulate him for the excellent work that he's been doing and he continues to do, and many others you may be playing.
Merci beaucoup.
Yeah, thanks, Jibril. And so I don't want to take any more time to introduce Richard, because he's a man of many things. I would like Richard himself to say what he wants people to know about him, and then dive in his presentation. We have a simultaneous translation, and therefore colleagues who are French speaking, please, but not Rwanda. Rwandese colleagues, you don't have to go to French. You first remain in English. Now that you are in East African community where English is dominant. Richard, I welcome you, and this is a group of experts from different countries, actually from the 5 sub-regions of Africa. All of them are practitioners from government, from civil society, and therefore you'll enjoy interacting with them, and I'm sure they are very keen to hear from you how you see Africa and the climate change discussion. Over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. George, and colleagues, good morning, and thank you very much for kickstarting these discussions today. Actually, I am not really going to tell you anything that you don't know. But what I'm going to do this morning is to have a conversation on how, building on the excellent work that our able and extreme negotiators have already done for the continent, and the young negotiators that are coming up can then be able to leverage on. But as a result of that, what I'm going to do is just to put in perspective what we are aware about. And what we know is that the reality of our continent is nothing new. And we know that this African proverb put things in perspective, that he whose house is burned down knows why arches cost a fortune. This African proverb aptly personifies Africa's predicament under the changing climate. It is akin to a house on fire. Africa is actually a house on fire when it comes to climate change. And what we know is that whenever a house is burning, several factors come into play in remediation. Among key ones are that first, the owner of that house tries his or her level best to put out the fire using the best tools that they have at the hand, not what they hope their neighbors could give them. And the second is that as they salvage the situation, they put up a plan to ensure they significantly degrade the risk of future fires and reduce the negative impacts in case such fires occur in future. And the third is, most importantly, inaction is never an option because they stand to lose everything. A lot of whether we lose everything or not depends on how we conduct negotiations now and into the future. And this is what I will be discussing with you today, and I consider myself privileged to be speaking to current and future negotiators. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a people without knowledge of their past history is like a tree without roots. Throughout history, every succeeding generation has been called upon to do that which exceeds them and to learn from the successes and failures of those who went before them. We in Africa do not have to look too far back for our lessons. Just over 60 years ago, we were counted as second class in our own continent. While not unique to Africa, because nearly every people of the globe were conquered at some point. The deprivation, the humiliation, the indignity of those times is best explained by those who underwent it. And books upon books have been written on this. But more exciting was the liberation, the vision, the endurance, the solidarity, the selflessness, and the fidelity to a cause that was displayed by those who fought for our liberation showed greatness that is reserved only for a special kind of people. The freedoms we all enjoy today costed the selflessness of those great men and women whom we will never meet. But the lesson still stands for all of us to emulate. But what do these lessons look like for climate change negotiations? Because we know that negotiations are about clarity of purpose, informed by an honest assessment of Africa's context. We know that negotiations are about a resolute objective and irreducible minimums. And most importantly, negotiations are about being selfless, knowing that the decisions you contribute to making are not for self, but on behalf of the over 1.2 billion citizens of the continent. With such responsibility, Africa's negotiator stands in the shoes of the historical greats that paved the route of Africa's emancipation. And while their battle at that time was political emancipation, our battle today is different. It is socio-economic battle. It is socio-economic battle because a keen look at the global architecture of negotiations reveal one fundamental principle, which is that context is everything. Context is important. Negotiators enter the room with one basic instinct to ensure the product accounts for the unique contextual circumstances of either your country or the entire African continent. And in our case, as the African continent, the writing is on the wall. We are in a region where, as we speak today, over 257 million citizens go to bed hungry. They will go to bed hungry tonight. They will go to bed hungry tomorrow and the entire year and years to come. We are in a continent that is warming faster than the entire globe. These are facts documented. We are in a region where every year 12 million youth join the ranks of disenfranchised in joblessness every year. A region whose economies are 20 times less productive than competitors in the global space. With all this in mind, whether we negotiate on Article 2 on ambition, or on Article 3 on NDCs, or Article 4 on mitigation, or 5 on RED, or Article 6 on market mechanisms, which have been of a lot of interest lately, or Article 7 on adaptation, or Article 8 on loss and damage, or 9 on finance, or Article 10 on technology transfer, or 11 on capacity building, our basic instinct in negotiation room should be how the final agreed text empowers and inspire our people to put food on the table. How the final agreed text inspire and empower our people to put more money in more pockets. Our mothers in villages, the informal sector that constitute over 80% of the entire population of the continent. Our negotiations, as we enter the room, should inspire and motivate how a youth can be able to find a job and enhance global competitiveness of our economies. As an example, when we take Article 6 on market mechanisms, and especially paragraph 2, has been a hot issue lately as the push towards net zero emissions by 2050 continues to escalate. But what we would like to see in Africa is how can investments from these market mechanisms be channeled to inclusive actions that have the potential to accelerate rapid enterprise development among our youth and especially the informal sector? These are practical, realistic questions. How can they be tapped to drive sustainable clean energy, agro-industrialization that can unlock over 17 million jobs and a $1 trillion US economy? These two sectors represent Africa's catalytic areas that transcend the social, economic, and climate space. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, another hot issue is finance. Africa's Article 9. One thing we can prioritize is how can Africa, which already, as we speak today, is already contributing 20% of its adaptation needs. That is currently finances contributed domestically. So how can this be leveraged as a bargaining chip that Africa is already contributing 20% of its adaptation need from its coffers? How can we be able to leverage this as a bargaining chip from a position of strength to ask for more money? Yet the 100 billion that was promised, we know the story better. These are examples of context that you as current And future negotiators must be able to premise as irreducible minimums in any negotiation room or hall or plenary representing Africa anywhere. It needs to be so because we know fully well that Africa's vulnerability is primarily socioeconomic. And I always use this example. A warning given to a mother in Mozambique, or in Cameroon, or in Togo, or in Niger, or in Senegal, or in Kenya, will not mean that much because that mother doesn't have the resources to be able to relocate herself. She is poor financially. She doesn't have the resources to be able to put food on the table. So the reality and our context is real, and we cannot discuss it as if sometimes it is not. For about a year now, Africa, like the rest of the globe, has been under the attack of the COVID-19 global pandemic. And that's one of the reasons we're having this meeting virtually. But beyond being a health crisis, it has morphed into an economic emergency, threatening to sink Africa further into vulnerability. As we speak today, the region's GDP is shrinking by about 5.1%. As we speak today, up to 50% of all jobs in the continent have been wiped out. As we read of trillions in emergency stimulus being issued by other countries across the world to buffer their respective economies, Africa has known to bail her out. And as the most vulnerable region to the changing climate and other socio-economic vulnerabilities, the continent needs not less than $100 billion in emergency support. Here then is the latest reminder of one of the most critical lessons that we seem to forget so easily. Just as an orphan calf licks its back, Africa cannot afford to always continuously externalize solutions to her challenges always. Because when the going gets tough, everyone retreats to take care of their own. And no amount of flowery talk will change this fact. We must face it head on in our approach to climate negotiations. And this calls for a new approach of transformational leadership, what I call values-based leadership. But I know that a lot of us listening are asking, what is this values-based leadership and who is responsible for it? Well, scriptures tell us that what has been will be. What has been done will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun. Just a keen look at history gives us the answer. In the late 1950s and 1960s, as the clamor for self-determined rule reached fever pitch, there arose self-appointed men and women, people who espouse boldness, people who espouse unshakable unity, people who espouse dedication, people who espouse selflessness and fidelity to a struggle to liberate their people. Their every move was governed by a laser-sharp focus and clarity of vision to win independence for their people. And no amount of persecution, no amount of threats could stand in their way. They did it not for themselves, but for their countries and for their continent, Africa. From west of Africa to the east of Africa, to the central of Africa, to the southern and northern part of the continent, they were joined ideologically in the struggle by timeless values of selflessness and character of humility, not materialism. It is this group of people who ultimately took the honor of being called our founding fathers today, and whose memory and legacy remains indelible in the chronicles of leadership. What they did was selflessly standing for Africa's cause, using what they had. They did not postpone this cause for a day in the hope for elusive perfection. This is the foundation of values-based leadership that climate change negotiations must identify with and champion. Yes, you are already doing that, but nothing wrong to continuously build on that and leverage this approach. As climate change negotiators, you must resolve to awaken these values within you. And it all starts with you looking in the mirror, reflecting deeply and answering these three fundamental questions that I'll leave you with today. What do I have to offer in solving the known climate change challenges already plaguing our continent as we negotiate? And the second question is, what can each of us, regardless of where we are and what we do, whether we're in civil society or we're in government, or we're in international organization, what can we individually do to ensure that we build Africa's climate resilience using make the lives of our citizens better through our negotiations. And the last question is each of us willing to take steps down this pathway of inclusive solutions? Just as was the case with our founding fathers. Answering these questions, I call them sobering questions for a reason. Answering them holds the key to each of us. Discovering our own unborrowed vision that will catapult us to personal transformational leadership in climate negotiation, as well as climate change implementation in the continent. From post-independent Africa to date, we have deviated from these values that won our independence in the first place. Truth be told, let's be realistic. Leadership has increasingly become a term used in the context of assuming positions of power and authority. Be it in government, be it in organizations, and many other forums. It is a term synonymous with privilege. Leadership is a term synonymous with privilege. The privilege of self-indulgence, of self-seeking, of self-serving, of self-actualization, and self-preservation. But had this been the spirit of our founding fathers, I guarantee you that today we will still be under colonialism. Though they dropped the ball soon after independence, we have an obligation as citizens of this African continent to learn from their successes. That leadership is about selflessness to touch many lives with what we have. That leadership is about clarity of vision. That leadership is about clarity of vision of intended progress. That leadership is about taking personal responsibility to ensure that the continent's well-being and progress is intact. And this is what we all need to become transformational, values-based leaders. And I'll leave you with 4 points as we ponder on how we can be able to leverage and pave the way forward as we build climate resilience in our negotiations. And the first is fundamentals are non-negotiable. If you tell a hungry child today, now, that you gave him or her food yesterday, that means nothing to that child. That means not that child is hungry now. And despite the fact that you gave him or her food yesterday, it means nothing now. That then means we cannot be able to do anything without thinking about how that child who is suffering in a village can be fed. In scriptures, we know that when the children of Israel were led out of slavery into the promised land, this was a transition from deprivation to abundance. While we may not all agree with Moses' leadership style, what we cannot miss is the fact that he led his people towards economic prosperity. This has been the foundation of leadership since time immemorial. Today, we must ask ourselves, with a changing climate, with a reality already dawning, manifesting through droughts and floods across the entire African continent, Sahel, the Horn of Africa, down to the southern part, how do we use what we have to ensure climate negotiations unlock socioeconomic opportunities out of the challenges we face in the continent? This is the prize we must all win for Africa in leveraging climate negotiations to drive socioeconomic opportunities for our mothers in villages, for the youth who need jobs. In Africa, a clear global abundance in clean energy and arable land, coupled with very high post-harvest losses and food imports, place us primarily to tap no less than 83 billion each and every year from very simple actions. We're talking local solutions like solar dryers that youth are fabricating across the continent and decentralizing to mothers in villages to reduce post-harvest losses. These are locally available solutions that are already building resilience in the continent. But the question then is, to what extent, when we negotiate globally, do we also leverage these local solutions to position ourselves? These are discussions. Yes, we do, but we need to continuously do so. Because the reality is that as we think, we negotiate from a global perspective. Yes, putting Africa in perspective, we must think local solutions to local challenges. Even though we negotiate from a global arena, as that is the only way to unlock socioeconomics. That takes me to the second point. You have little power over what is not yours. You must answer yourself honestly is to determine what you really have. And what you really have is yourself. By yourself, I mean your skills. It is your responsibility to continuously improve, refine, and adapt your skills to ensure you are well equipped to win over the prize of socioeconomic opportunities for the entire African continent. Whenever we get to negotiations and ensuring you position Africa to tap into contemporary opportunities that climate action presents in the catalytic areas that I've already mentioned. And the third point, which is actually one of the most important points that we need to understand, everything is context. Context is everything. That's the first point. Context is everything. We must take our time to understand issues in their entirety and not to ascribe to narratives or dimensions presented to us without critiquing them and synthesizing better ones that suit our context as the African continent. And I say so because while Africa stands out as the most vulnerable region to climate change, the continent also stands to gain the most from climate action solutions, as well as lose most from the failure of taking these actions. But the climate action narrative, let's be honest to ourselves, the climate action narrative is always choreographed thousands of kilometers away from this continent. And we voluntarily ascribe to these narratives without coming up with more befitting counter-narratives. A very typical narrative as far as climate action in the African continent is concerned is that it is presented as a social issue. It is presented as an issue that we seem as if we are not doing anything on the ground. The continent of Africa today is doing a lot. It's doing a lot. I mentioned the 20% where from domestic resources, the continent is already financing adaptation. Our mothers in villages applying nature-based solutions. These actions already exist. Our young people putting in place solar, they do exist. But what's my point? My point is simple, that we have never explored and expanded on the narrative that, in fact, climate change is with us. In fact, climate change is already inflicting pain and suffering in the continent. We see it every day. But leveraging climate action as an enterprise and an investment opportunity for the continent is the way to go, because it offers solutions to some key challenges the continent faces in a way that can unlock enterprise opportunities and create millions of jobs for our youth. Just to give you a very simple example, consider the challenge of deforestation driven by charcoal burning. Traditionally, the approach prescribed is usually always plant trees, yes, fine, we must plant trees. But the question is, planting trees alone is not enough. How many enterprise opportunities can this generate? Your guess is as good as mine. But on the flip side, the broader waste recovery paradigm presents the most accessible, non-capital intensive, and potentially most impactful enterprise areas that youth can engage in. Over 80% of households in sub-Saharan Africa rely on wood-based biomass energy, firewood and charcoal for cooking. As a result, up to 67% of forest degradation is attributed to firewood and charcoal harvesting. This then means that waste recovery to energy sets one on a trajectory to recoup the over 20 billion charcoal industry currently expanded and actually reduce the pressure on forests, save more forests, from briquette making to biofertilizer making, turning agricultural waste to fabricating of clean cook stoves and trading in this product. The choices are diverse. So let us not always follow narratives, but rather let us interrogate and contextualize them to unlock more opportunities for us. This is what our future negotiators should espouse. And that takes me to the fourth point, which is finance. The question of finance, this African proverb put it in perspective that money is sharper than the sword. This speaks of the importance of financial capital. Africa needs resources to build climate resilience, fact. But when you look at Article 9.2, it also talks about looking voluntarily. There's nothing wrong with that. But in no way are we saying that the developed world should abdicate their responsibility to fund and provide 100 billion a year. That must happen. But my first proverb about a house on fire, only those who lost the house on fire can understand that ashes cost more. One key question that is hardly answered is, do we need finance at scale or impact at scale alone? When the finance comes, which we need as a continent, we must. Do we have the skill sets at the same time? Africa needs impact at scale. And for this, finance cannot be approached in the traditional sense, but build on structures that are well known in the continent. I hardly hear us talking about what we know that is well established, the structures of communal cooperatives, structure of low-risk financing that we call communal cooperatives. Every community in the continent have got this. This exists in nearly every village in the continent. In finance negotiations, We need to start thinking how we can push decisions that will support the continent to fully tap this low restructure of cooperatives to finance climate action at the informal sector level, where up to 80% of our mothers, of our brothers and sisters draw their livelihoods. And that takes me to the last point. We must be selfless. No one can address the monumental challenges facing the continent alone. No single individual can do it. We must work with one another, with a singular focus on solutions, not our differences. As we set forth to become a transformational negotiators, of course you are, but we must then be able to leverage and know that there are times that we will be doubted. You will be doubted. There are times that others will let you down, even your supporters, they will neglect you. But what we should never forget, and what will keep you grounded is what I call an unborrowed vision, where you work to leave a legacy, not only to touch those lives that you know, but millions of lives that wallow in poverty. But be encouraged that throughout history, throughout centuries, there were men and women who, just like you, took the first step down new roads. As they took this first step down new road, they were armed with nothing, but only their vision. Their goals differ, but just like us today, the only thing they had in common was that the step they were taking was first. The route was new, and the vision was unborrowed. They were not experimenting anyone's vision. But as they stepped out, the response they got was hatred and jealousy. These great men and women, these great creators, these great thinkers, these great artists, these great scientists, these great inventors stood alone against the men of their time. Every great thought they had was opposed. Every great invention was denounced. The airplane was considered impossible. Anesthesia was considered sinful. But these great men and women of unborrowed vision went ahead to do what they set their eyes on. They fought, they suffered, they paid the price of hatred and jealousy. But despite all this hatred, they endured and became victorious because they stood for what was right for the community, solutions, using what they had to drive their vision. This is the spirit of dedication, the spirit of collectivism, the spirit of selflessness, absolutely paramount for success in positioning Africa favorably in the present and future negotiations. I thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Always very inspiring. I always enjoy the African parables that you use and every time that we interact. Very, very educative. So colleagues, I think what Richard is simply telling us is what is the African narrative in the climate change discourse. And as African experts, are we going just to accept those narratives out there, or we have a vision and therefore we are rallying all our thoughts and resources and everything on that African narrative? I think that's important. So I don't want to dilute what Richard has said. I think the floor is open. If you have any questions, you could raise your hand or put it in the chat, and then we'll be able to follow through. So we have about 10 minutes, which we can interact so that Richard can provide additional support as based on the questions that may emerge. So who wants to go first? Yes, Cecil.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm like in the mess of big, so many roads, and I don't know which one will lead me where. I'm very much, thank you so much. I'm very much interested in the context is everything. I got it very well. The context is everything. And Africa has their own narrative that we have to use, that we have to know, that we have to push for in negotiations. If I got it right, then I'm very happy. Now, my question is on value-based leadership. Please get back to that for me. I did not catch it very well, especially how we who have this opportunity to be trained in this program, how can we value what our late fathers were trying to push for, the vision? Can you explain that more for me, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot, Cecile. You got the context very well. You summarized it very well. Yes, you got everything perfect. Context is everything. And if you miss context, especially from a narrative perspective, then you will get nearly everything wrong. So you got that very well. The values-based leadership was very simple. Our founding fathers fought for self-determined rule. Nobody appointed them to do that. They did it because it was the right thing to do, and they gave their best. They did not wait to have what they needed to get in terms of material. They didn't say that, oh, we needed a lot of money to act. But they didn't say that, no, we needed to have so many people on board to act. But they showed one value that was very important, which is selflessness. Not doing it for themselves, but doing it for the entire continent, whether people were from the Western or the Eastern or the Central or the Northern or the Southern African part of the region. They wanted to liberate the continent. Are those values today values that each and every one of us espouses? Your guess is as good as mine. No. So the negotiations in the continent today, our negotiators have done excellent and they're doing well, and we should all support them. But as we move into this realistic arena, we are now negotiating post-COVID. Things are never going to be the same again. This is reality. Economies are in recession. People have lost their jobs. People are struggling. The resources sometimes that we'll be looking for, we will not get it. What then will negotiations mean post-COVID? That's the reality. And that's what I said. If we do not nurture the values of selflessness, the values of kindness, the values of dedication, the values to ensure that at least regardless of anything, we cannot give up, because what matters is the 1.2 billion citizens and above. That unless they go to bed with food on the table, we should never ever rest anywhere in peace if we do not give our best to ensure that whatever thing we do through the negotiation process is having that mother and that child in the village in our minds.
So thanks, Richard. Very, very important, very powerful. The question is, when you have that position of talking on behalf of Africa, do it selflessly, without thinking of the benefit you're going to get, but for the benefit of the continent. I think that is the key important point that Richard is emphasizing. But also the narrative, the African narrative. I've been in this space for many years, Richard, as you would appreciate.
Yeah, I know.
And for many, sometimes when you read what they write about Africa, then you start wondering whether they're talking about a different Africa. And so our scientists, our expert practitioners, what narrative, even if it's looking at adaptation, what narrative do we have for Africa? And Richard gave a very good example. The last point he gave, finance. we always talk about finance as if though once we got all the finance, all our problems will be solved. That's not true. The reality is, and I think Jibril will tell you, because Jibril is the chair of the adaptation fund, he will tell you that there are countries who have received climate finance and the absorption rate is 20%, less than 50%, including my own country, Kenya. There are projects, activities that have been approved, but 1 year down the line, they were at 14%. That's unacceptable. And yet we keep on crying that we want finance. So that is the challenge Richard was giving you, that don't assume finance is everything. No, you need to do a little bit more. You need commitment. You need somebody who can drive action. Because if you don't drive action, then you'll be a lot of doing talking, and at the end of the day, you will not deliver anything. The floor is open. Who wants again to make a contribution? Jibril, I will volunteer you to say something as we wait.
Yes, George. You see, I was looking for where I can access the floor.
Please go ahead.
Okay, because we have a translation, I think I can speak easily in French. Eh?
Yes, you can speak French and then.
No, in French, in French.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Ok, merci beaucoup, hein, merci infiniment Georges hein, pour cette opportunité. Et merci beaucoup à notre grand ami Richard, hein, qui est vraiment très éloquent. C'est toujours avec plaisir que je le suis. Je voudrais remercier Georges, notre leader, hein, et sincèrement pour dire...
good job. Very frankly, les contextes, national contexts are important.
I'm getting the translation. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Continue. I also think the regional and sub-regional context are very, very important because the scope may be larger than the national context. So the narrative should help us to better negotiations. What Dr. George said is real. Very frankly, we have cases which are very interesting, where we are struggling each time in terms of funding. In actual fact, we don't have the capacity to absorb the funding. That is a real problem. I fully agree with Richard. We are fighting to get funding, but to use the fund is a problem. It's a real problem. Like Burkina Faso has the funds, but has not been able to spend. This can be explained by different factors. First of all, the national context, which is not favorable in order to implement the activities. It is not also easy to get national experts who could contribute to implement our projects, and also institutional arrangements which are not favorable. That's why we need a favorable climate for when we talk about funding, we should not overlook technical aspects in climate change issues. I would like to note, as the founding fathers, we should also try to mobilize internal funding. We should not expect too much from the international partners. We may be disappointed. But if we fight to get internal resources. It could facilitate their intervention in terms of funding. This is what I wanted to add in short. I support the initiative to have national experts in order to prepare bankable projects. But once we have the projects, how could be in position to absorb the finances, as Dr. George emphasized. We need a favorable environment in order to attract funding and absorb the funding. This is what, let me stop here. This is what I wanted to contribute. But if you have specific questions, I will be in a position to reply. But in short, I am very happy with the debate for negotiations. It is the key, but the funding issue does not give us all solutions. We should be in a position to absorb the funding and have appropriate strategies in favor of populations. Thank you, Dr. George.
Thanks, Jibril. Before Richard comes in, could we hear from Zainab? Zainab, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. George. Thank you, Dr. Richard.
Thank you, Zainab.
Yeah, I do understand very well the context, and I am very happy to you point that. And I'm thinking that we should go far from narrative, and sometimes ask, as we are doing as observer, we are still asking to our negotiator, to west side part, to come and visit our country to see to see very well how our country is living in the context of climate change. So my question is how to go further than the narrative and to let them see very well. And I want to focus on the battle between, for example, adaptation and mitigation. You know, as West Side people is focusing on mitigation, then African people on adaptation. The problem here is how can they, in the negotiation, let people, Western people, come and see our reality, and to go to talk about finance aspect. I see our negotiators say yes, it is not about financial problem because it is implementing problem. But how can negotiation, African negotiator of African government work together with civil society who are implementing on the ground and have a lack of money, of finance to work, but cannot work because they are a lack of work? Then government people have money and they cannot implement the things. How can we have this collaboration and the open mind of government to let civil society and use the money and work? How can I do that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Zainab. I think, Richard, this is a very important question because, as you know, there is a hope that at COP26 we'll finish the rule book, and then between now and 2030, it is simply implementation. So the question, if you can give some guidance in respect to that. Richard, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. George, and colleagues who have provided comments like Ebila, my friend Ebila in Benin, and Zainab. Before I get to Zainab, which will take a little bit of time, is just to acknowledge Ebila's point. Ebila was providing more clarification in addition to what George has already provided, and he was just making the point that we need to look internally as well as we also look externally in our negotiations. So it cannot just be, yes, the other finance aspect is supposed to be obeyed and respected, but internally we need to start also looking what we can do. So he was more emphasizing that. Back to Zainab's question. Thank you very much. Zainab, I think you asked so many questions in one, which is good. I'm going to answer them. Maybe I'll segment them so that at least we don't lose any part. The first is, you said we need to go beyond narrative. Yes, the narrative was never to happen in isolation. The narrative needs to happen as we're getting to action. But as we get to action, remember, with the wrong narrative, you will get the wrong action. Without the right narrative, like the current narrative now that without money we cannot do anything, and George explained, and that's true, absorption rate in African countries is low. Does it mean that we don't need money? No. So my point on the narrative is, if you do not know where you are going, any road will take you there. That's an African proverb. If you do not know where you are going, any route will take you to anywhere. And what does that mean? If we know that our narrative is about socio-economic, our actions on the ground should be to put food on the table and put more money in more pockets of those mothers in the village, of those youth who are looking for jobs. Then anything we do will be about to create impact on the ground. That's a narrative. But most of the time, the narratives are choreographed elsewhere, and we swallow them without interrogating. That's a fact. We are all guilty of this. And we need to apologize to our continent, all of us. That's number one. Number two is you said something which is very important, and I want to really elaborate on this. And I think it's something that I've been observing for quite a very long time across the continent. Yes, Africa's priority is adaptation. That's a fact, established. But we've not asked the question, how can we leverage mitigation to power adaptation? Let me just give you a very simple example. In Turkana or Sambura, because of drought, the mother cannot even plant her cabbages or her skumawiki. But a solar power irrigation, which is a mitigation action, will not only ensure that she gets efficient irrigation, but her crop will be grown. Isn't that resilience building? That's adaptation. But leveraging a mitigation action to power adaptation. Why is our narrative not around, yes, we are not reducing emission because Africa is a negligible emitter, fact. But we will assess mitigation solutions to power adaptation. That doesn't mean that our priority is not adaptation, it's still about resilience. But we have not formulated that narrative. We've said adaptation, fine. Adaptation alone cannot survive without the supporting power of mitigation solutions. But the mitigation solutions that are context specific, not those other ones that will be thrown down on others. Therefore, in answering your question, I have already answered it. Africa priority is adaptation, but we need mitigation to power adaptation. Let me contextualize with another practical example, which is also about a narrative. Africa is a food insecure continent. Who said? And it's true, but what is the context? Africa is losing 48 billion US dollars every year because of post-harvest losses. True. How do you lose when you have not produced? We carry it on our head. Africa imports food worth 35 billion US dollars. When you add 48 billion US dollars as a result of post-harvest losses to 35, you are talking over almost 83 billion. How do you then reverse the post-harvest losses? You need mitigation solutions, preservation, a solar dryer. For what? To build resilience so that mother doesn't lose her food. When she gets the food, she can sell it, she will put more money in the pockets. That's why I keep saying our battle is socio-economic resilience now. It's no longer emancipation like our founding father. So my point in simplicity is Africa needs mitigation solutions, our adaptation. That's a narrative we have not perfected, and that's what negotiation should leverage. That's number two. Number three, on the finance, when I intentionally leverage the leadership of our founding fathers to have this discussion with everyone today, both future negotiators and current negotiators, because of that value of selflessness, the values of selflessness that they espouse. Africa will not be able to drive climate resilience in terms of implementation without everyone's hands on deck. We need state and non-state actors. Government alone cannot do it. Civil society alone cannot do it. International organization alone cannot do it. We need everybody, including individual citizens who are not attached to any organization. My point is coming to the point where you say, how can negotiations work together? Everybody needs to work together. And what I think, and I don't know what George and colleagues think about this, and I think this should be a very crucial aspect to discuss in these lessons and discussions that you have the entire month, which is, yes, in as much as negotiations, the global negotiations are one stream, how about continental negotiations? Why don't we also have continental negotiations, in this case, with negotiators engaging the whole of society to discuss what they have discussed and agree at their means for them in terms of implementation and what each of their role is? That hasn't happened. And if it has happened, I stand corrected because I am not aware. And I believe going forward, if we miss this, we will get all the money in the world, but Africa's vulnerability will never change. It will get worse. We will spend time fighting around the money as our mothers in villages continuously get drowned by floods, drowned by droughts, as crop failure plunge millions into suffering. And we sit there talking about the same thing that we've been talking for the past 32 years. Don't get me wrong, please. The continent is doing well in negotiation. Africa is the only continent that have ratified the Paris Agreement more than any other continent in the first 4 years or so. And that must be applauded. But it doesn't also mean that we should be shy, afraid of speaking truth to the realities that we face in the continent. That's what sometimes we miss. We must speak the truth. And what is the truth? We do not like to work together as a continent. It's not about negotiations. We don't like to work. We like to work alone.
Okay, Richard, we've had, yeah, but I think as a flow from Zainab and Richard's intervention, I think I have to carry forward things that probably we could engage further with Richard and ourselves and see how we push it further. One is the narrative. We know since 1992, when we were negotiating the UNFCCC and the other multilateral developmental agreements, we said adaptation is priority for Africa. I agree, but the reality is different. There's more money in mitigation than in adaptation. And I think Jibril can give us the statistics. So how do we leverage mitigation resources to build resilience? I think that is the challenge. And I think as we proceed with this course, we will try to see how do we package a framing that incorporates both adaptation and mitigation without deviating from the priority of Africa in respect to adaptation. Then the second one, which I think Richard has raised, which I think is very important, is do we have space where the negotiators finally come back to engage with the other stakeholders on the continent to share the outcome of the negotiations and the actions thereof, and build a team, a collective action among all the players. I think that is a challenge that Richard has challenged us, and I think we will need to look at how do we do this. I know we are all exact time, but I think Alex had raised his hand. So let's listen to Alex, and then we can see if Richard can make the final remarks, and then we can have a few minutes to discuss ourselves on the organization of the course. So Alex, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, George, for giving me the time. In our introductory, on the introductory, I told you that I'm not so much experienced in the climate change issues, but during Richard's talk, something did caught my attention. He mentioned two things. He mentioned something called financial leverage and financial scale and impact scale. And I have a question on that. Richard, if you could let me know if you have experience in interventions with respect to climate change, whether in Africa, we have evidence, a body of evidence to demonstrate that actually the kind of resources that we have been mobilizing go into impactful interventions. And I'm using the word impact not in the literal sense, but from the scientific point of view, where you can attribute interventions to the kind of results that we are looking for, because we mobilize billions and billions of whether US dollars, pounds, or whatever currency to put into interventions that we want to see producing results, evidence-based results. Do we have a body of evidence to demonstrate that every penny we invest produces the kind of impact that we are looking for?
Yeah. Thank you very much. With George's permission, I think I can just jump to answer. You are the chair.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Alex. I think that's a very important question. And before I get to answer your question, let me just clarify what I meant, because it will also help make the answer to your question easier. What I asked was a question: do we need only finance at scale or impact at scale? And I said Africa needs impact at scale, not only finance at scale alone. And I used the word alone. Yeah, and I did it intentionally because I knew that there would be a question that would come. And what I meant by that, and I think that Ebila put it very excellently with Cecilia, and I think even Zenab and Dr. Wamukoya, where if you have money, and this is, and I'll get to your question, I'll answer it very fully. But before I get into that, because I want all our colleagues to understand, if each and every African citizen, let me say 1.2 billion and above, is given each $1 trillion US each, do you think that climate resilience in a continent will be built immediately? Your guess is as good as mine. The second is, without a passionate, purposeful, dedicated workforce or skilled people, you might not get returns on investment, even if you account for all the dollars. What am I trying to say? If you give $1 trillion US with people without the skills to be able to implement ecosystem-based adaptation, or without the skills to be able to put in place climate action solutions of solar dryers, and then it ends up in workshops, that will be accounted. Doesn't mean that it has translated to impact on the ground. No. So what my argument has been, Africa needs resources, financial resources, but Africa also needs human resource to be able to leverage that financial resource to make impact in the communities that need it most. And I call that skills retooling. So to your question, whether we do have the body of evidence of how every penny has been used, I would answer it differently. We do have a body of evidence of actions that have happened in every community across the continent, but those are pockets of actions. And sometimes they even happen being taken by our mother without any money. Let me tell you, most of us grew up in villages. Our mother using cow dung or organic manure to apply in their 1 acre or less than 1 acre farm and harvest, bumper harvest of tomatoes or of vegetables or sukuma wiki. And when there are droughts, their crops still grow and they have bumper harvest and they sell a bit of it. Which amount of money did they use to apply those things in their farms? What I am trying to argue here is that the resources for adaptation may not necessarily only be about grand projects. If a legislative process is facilitated and a country have a climate action bill or a climate action act, that's impact. If young people are trained to learn how to turn waste to briquettes, and they later on take those skills to start developing their own climate action enterprises, that's impact. Do we have a body of all that in one place? Not as yet, but I think that's a very good area for researchers to be able to start looking into and creating a kind of a compendium of these kind of solutions, but not just from the perspective of impact being only grand project, because lastly, the part I want to answer is that that mother that I use, my mother in the village who apply organic fertilizers and organic manure and gets a vegetable, still loses them and ends up being poor at the end of the day because she never have a preservation technique. What if you had a climate action solution of a solar dryer? So to what extent do we then not only see finance as a solution, but see finance as part of an enabler? It's a means, not an end. But we have made the narrative that finance automatically Africa becomes a climate resilient continent because we have money, and I think that is not right. That was a very good question. But George, let's do justice to answer 2 questions on the chat that I've seen. If not,
go ahead quickly.
Thank you very much, and to colleagues. I think the questions came from Daniel Kure. Your question was about climate science, and what you asked specifically, I think it was more a comment and then a question where you say your impression is that our political leadership has failed to appreciate the role of science in addressing some of the challenges we are facing. What is your view on this, and what do we need to change this status quo? Knowledge is never given. Knowledge is acquired. Power, I'm not talking political power here. I'm talking the power of a narrative here. Is never given. It is taken. What am I trying to say? The body of knowledge of science in the continent, we must work with what we have as we perfect it. Have we leveraged what we know and the scientific studies and evidence that have emerged from our researchers in the continent to propagate it, not only to transform and influence policy? Have we tried to make that become the norm by ensuring that every policy and decision that is made, we need to also engage policymakers and sometimes present this to them, not just from a scientific dimension, but on what it can help contribute to the broader economy. The politicians and policymakers, they're concerned about economic growth. They're concerned about jobs for the youth. So to what extent do we also tailor the science to not only make it a silo climate action discussion, but more fit into the broader economic-wide opportunity? So it's also about narrative. Science that relates to drive the narrative, but from a socio-economic opportunity. And that's really something that I think we need to do. I am not really a fan of those who blame government, because governments are people that come from our own very society. And if we go there, I don't think we will not be blamed. So to what extent do we correct the wrong so that others who will be entering that will enter with the mindset that climate action is a socio-economic opportunity? Because government is not a person, it's not a building, it's all of us. I know what I am saying here. The other last question was, what are we doing in Africa to provide climate negotiators with that power? Or let me just read the entire. I am concerned about the state of science and research. I think it's almost like I take, this was from Tuophil. I think Africa needs to strengthen the involvement of scientists and researchers, especially that climate negotiation. I think that's a very good point. And we led a report in 2013 and 2015, in addition to other reports in the continent. And worked together with George. George, we used to be in this arena together, and we still are. Africa Adaptation Gap 1 report and Africa Adaptation 2 report, you know about it, where it provided a clear direction. So it's not absence of science per se, it's what do we use that science to do with that and help make someone who doesn't know anything about science get excited to do something that actually transform and drive socioeconomic opportunities. We can't just talk the science as science without linking it to broader the agenda of development of a country or region. So the data we have, we need to package it and leverage it. And I think that the negotiators don't lack the science per se at the moment, to the best of my knowledge. I think I stand corrected, George, if you can correct me. I think they have done their best with what they have. But I think the science now should not just be about negotiating, but it should be to also help inform. Like what Alex said, how can implementation become optimal? Not only with financial resources, but also with the tools and skill sets that are needed to make sure that if these resources come and you have these skill sets, it can actually move the needle forward as a result of creating this X number of jobs and economic opportunities. And the last question, I think as I was speaking, more were coming in.
We need to end, Richard. We need to end. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Richard is a highly knowledgeable colleague, and we'll give you his contacts, because he's one person that would like to respond to some of your concerns. But I think, Alex, the point that you raised about impact is very important and is going to run across the whole month as we go through this course. The question is, are the actions that we are implementing impactful? Or is just a question of trying to appear like we're implementing something? And I think at some stage we will invite Richard again to share with us, and particularly when we'll be discussing that. So with that, I want to thank Richard for your time, and request you to log off so that we can go into our in-house housekeeping. But otherwise, thank you very much. We are very, very grateful. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, George, and thanks to everyone. I appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so colleagues, sorry, we have overrun the time, but there was a request that was made by Haman from Rwanda regarding the timeframes as to when we should have these classes. And I recall explaining the rationale for having one session in the middle of the day or close to the middle of the day, midday, and early morning on the West Africa part, and then a late afternoon in respect to this. Bear in mind that we don't want to see classes being done after 7. So 7 p.m. In the context of East Africa, because then people will be in different things. So that is the reason why we found this balance, and therefore bear in mind that we have people from West Africa, people from Central Africa, and people from Eastern Africa, which all of them will have different time zones. I don't know whether colleagues have reflected on this issue, so that we are able to make some determination, or if not, because we will run this time, we could pick it up at 4 after the initial introduction of the first class. But the intention is we want all participants, not from one region, attending the course. We want a mix because we are building climate leaders for Africa. Because if I just have a session for Rwanda colleagues only, then they will not learn from the other colleagues from the other parts of the region and of the Africa region. And that's why we try to find a balance. So I would request, given the time that we overrun, whether Haman, it's possible we could pick it up in the afternoon session so that we can give time to colleagues to react. The intention is we have one unified class that has a representation and participants from across the continent, as opposed to of having a specific one for one region. Haman, what do you think? Haman? Haman, do you hear me? Alex, is Haman able to hear me?
I think you've left the chat.
Okay.
Probably his connection, but I don't see him. Maybe he's trying to log in again.
Okay, I can see him on. He says, yeah, we can. He can hear me, but I can't hear him. But one way we could do this is, Janet, is it possible for us to pick up this issue at in the afternoon, so that we create time for all the participants who want to say something to say on behalf of the Rwanda team?
Yes, I think that makes sense. As far as I'm concerned, I think that would make a lot of sense. But yeah, we are a big group on this call. So maybe we could hear from the rest.
Okay, thanks, Alex, for me. So, colleagues, sorry, we have overrun the session by 17 minutes, which we didn't plan. We thank you very much, and I'm sure you have learned something from Richard. Richard has raised a number of issues which are going to run across the whole course, and especially the point that Zainab and Alex raised, but also what Jibril did indicate. We will also be looking out for you, particularly Alex, to share with us some of the experiences. I know Rwanda is implementing a lot of activities there, and from being a practitioner, it will be interesting to hear from you what you think about the issue of impact in the manner that we implement, we design and implement. Because if we get the design wrong, then you obviously will not get the desired results, or we may record to have achieved something which in fact may not be useful in the manner that we would have liked. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you at 4, at which we'll be able to pick up, discuss the organization of the course, where if we all agree, then we may be able to make some adjustments. But I just want to reemphasize the intention is to have a team that is representative across Africa, so that you are able to learn from each other, as opposed to having just one group from. So in terms of time, when it's 4, it means that it is 3 in Central Africa, and it is it 1 in West Africa, and 4 in East Africa. So just remember those timelines. But my colleagues are going to share with you a reminder of the time of the link and the time, and looking forward to seeing you at 4. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, George.